Good morning. The first witness this morning wishes to be known, I think, as Ruth.
Ruth, sir. That's correct.
Ruth.
Please state your full name.
My full name is Irene Ruth Spellman.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Ruth, you're here to give evidence about your late husband, Bill. Can you tell us how you met?
Well, we met in London. He was just doing his teacher training, and we were both living in a flat in London, and that's how we met. We met at a party, and we just clicked. I found he was very easy to talk to. I was kind of newly switching between flats, and I felt quite alone in London, and Bill made me feel very, very much at home right from the word go.
Before he retrained as a teacher, what did Bill do?
He was a research physicist working for a number of different companies in his 20s, and then found his vocation in his early 30s, which is when I met him. He desperately did want to become a teacher rather than do research and be locked away in a cabinet somewhere. He had a great desire to contribute knowledge to children in particular in the secondary school, and that's what he was training to do.
And can you tell us a little bit of what Bill was like as a person?
Well, he was, when I first met Bill, and really all through his life, he was a very family-orientated person. So he came from a massive family in the northeast of England. He has 8 brothers and sisters. And he was the youngest of the boys, and then he had 5 sisters as well. And he was the only one to go to grammar school and then on to university. So they're all very, very proud of him, as we were. He got his job as a teacher, as I say, and he was extraordinarily good at his job and loved his job, passionate about his children and family as well. And obviously when they came along, they were the centre of his life. He also, he liked his football, as they do in the northeast, and he was a big fan of Newcastle United and in the glory days. And he is responsible for the fact that my son William is a massive football supporter too, although unfortunately he supports Tottenham Hotspur. And I blame him for that. And he and Will used to watch Match of the Day, and he used to participate quite a lot in out-of-school activities, both with children from the school and with my own children. And every year a prize is presented at his school in his name for the most promising scientist. He loved the kids he taught, those who tried hard, as well as the ones who were, clever. His high points in life, I think, were celebrating my OBE in 2007, and I think there's a picture that I've given you today to show that occasion. And I think the other thing was just seeing his own children graduate, because he lived to do that, just. He was always a positive person, looked on the bright side of life, glass half full, even in very dark days. And he loved his tennis and squash when he was younger. And as he got older, he would have a sing-song with the children. Both girls play the piano very well. And what I do remember is friends coming around and being very moved by his lovely tenor voice. As I said about the northeast, children have 55 cousins up there, and all those brothers and sisters, and they're part of his long-term legacy to the family. We're all very close. And of course, I have 4 sisters too. One of my sisters here in the room today, and they dearly love Bill. His colleagues at work, I think Chris is my friend here, she taught with Bill for many years, would say he was a stern disciplinarian at school, one of the few that could maintain discipline at times, and I don't exaggerate. But he also took the job very seriously, always went dressed in a suit. He was always punctilious and did his best for the kids and got very good results. And he was very much a valued colleague. I think the only thing is I would also like to mention is he befriended people. So quite a few of the medics that he saw over his 20 years of being ill, he got quite friendly with, would have proper conversations with, and that was very, very important to him, not to be treated like a statistic, to be treated as a human being, because he always did the same in return. I would say also, my biggest regret that he didn't walk down the aisle with his two lovely daughters. He will not be at his son's wedding this year, and he will never meet his gorgeous grandson, Henry. He died in 2009 of hepatitis C and cirrhosis of the liver. And to this day, I don't think the thing I regret most is the amount of pain he endured. And also that he didn't live to see any kind of retirement. He had to retire early at 60. Last years of his life were very painful.
We're going to talk about all of that.
Can I just interrupt and say, there's no rush.
Yeah, thank you.
Take your time.
Thank you.
You're talking very quickly, but we all want to hear everything you have to say. So we're in no rush.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let's go back to when Bill was first diagnosed. In October 1989, he was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. Can you tell us what treatment he underwent at that stage?
Well, we were all at home. He'd had a blood test at the end of September, having felt unwell most of the summer. And the doctor came out that evening, which is a pretty unusual occurrence, and said he thought it was suspected leukemia and he would need to go into hospital the following day, which he did. This was in the beginning of October, and he didn't come out until Christmas, and then that was just on a temporary few days because he'd had, in the meanwhile, huge doses of chemo. And he had to be isolation nursed in a hospital that wasn't really catering for that. So he was in a small room on his own, and they had to give him chemo in very heavy doses. Dr. Davis, who was then treating him in the hospital, said that he had a 25% chance of survival.
And Bill underwent, in the end, 3 courses of heavy chemotherapy. And throughout that time, he was barrier nursed. And you had a rule that it was only you that would go and see him, wasn't it?
Well, that was Dr. Davis's rule, that he was very vulnerable to infections of any kind. As small as cold, as small as germ would have killed him. So I had to gown up. It was a single room. He had to be closeted in it. Everything he did was in that room. It was very difficult, actually, because not only was he extremely ill, he was incredibly isolated. The children were young at the time. My youngest daughter, Fiona, was 2, and William was 6, and Rhiannon was 4. So the reality of the situation was he couldn't see them and they couldn't see him between early October and Christmas. And then when he came home, it was for a very brief period. All his body hair had gone. He'd lost 2 stone in weight. He didn't look like Dad, but it didn't make any difference to them. And then he went back in for another dose, which went on for another 2 months. And then because Dr. Davis was insecure about it having properly worked, he gave him another dose. And it was by the spring that he said, no, that's enough, either this has worked or there's no point in going any further. And he warned us that this may not be full remission and that we would need to wait 5 years before we would know the outcome, really, of whether he was going to relapse into leukemia, which is subsequently why he was tested. He was actually put forward to Adam Brooks Hospital to have some of his bone marrow harvested, because they may have wanted to give him a bone marrow transplant at that stage if he should relapse.
During that treatment with all the chemotherapy, he also received blood products and whole blood.
Yes.
And it was through that those blood products, that blood that he received, that he contracted hepatitis C.
Yes.
When did he become aware of that?
It was in 1993, and I was at the meeting because Dr. Davis had asked both of us to go there. By this stage, I knew Dr. Davis very well. I'd been there at 3 o'clock in the morning when he'd rung me to come in because he didn't think Bill was going to get through the night. I talked to him on many occasions when Bill was just not able to deal with things. So Dr. Davis and I became friends, and he rang and said that he thought that we should both be at this particular meeting. We didn't really know what it was going to be about, and I thought it might be either he was in full remission from the leukemia, or he had relapsed. So we were very uncertain going into that meeting. So I do recall it quite well.
Just before we talk about the contents of that meeting, there had been some concerns about Bill's liver before that, hadn't there?
There had.
Could we have document 0179002, please? It's a letter from Dr. Davis in February 1990. And if we look at the last paragraph, we can see that it said, "I'm a little concerned about his liver function tests, which continue to be abnormal. This may be related to non-A, non-B hepatitis transmitted with the blood products he received when an inpatient. Mr. Spellman's due to be reviewed at Addenbrooke's." So in 1990, there was some concern about liver function, but it wasn't entirely clear what was happening.
Yes.
And then, as you say, Bill was going to be having his bone marrow harvested at Addenbrooke's, and about the same time he underwent a liver biopsy.
Yes.
What was the outcome of that?
Well, again, we were just told that he had an abnormal liver, really no more than that at that stage. It wasn't till his appointment in 1993 that we received a diagnosis of hepatitis C. And also at that stage, we didn't really know what that meant. Dr. Davis then explained, he looked embarrassed for the first time I'd ever met. He was such a straightforward, such a dedicated professional person. He was never embarrassed about anything. And as I said, we knew each other well by then. I trusted him and he trusted me. But he came into the room and he looked embarrassed. And I thought, well, what is this about? Because it was an odd behaviour. And then he said, look, some really not very good things have been done. I didn't know it at the time, but I was giving Bill blood that was polluted. It was being imported from the American prison system, both blood and blood products. And he said he has contracted hepatitis C from that. And he told us also that there had been a heat treatment available that Bill could have had, that the blood could have had, but it was costly to do it, and the blood authority had decided not to do it. And as a consequence of that, Bill had contracted hepatitis C. And the results of that were pretty unknown because he didn't at that stage know what there are lots of different types of hep C. And he said, I don't know how treatable it's going to be, but I do know there's no known cure at the moment, and that it could have long-term consequences for Bill, including damage to his vital organs, and it could lie dormant for many years. So he gave us a very, I think he told us what he knew at that time. I think he was acutely embarrassed that having fought as hard as we had and he had to keep Bill alive, to get him through the leukemia, which was an amazing achievement for him and for Bill, that he was delivering such bad news. And by his demeanour, I knew it was bad news. Although he was very careful to say, there's lots of ways we can, but then that was really the sum total of the meeting.
You've said in your statement that Dr. Davis specifically said he had given Bill polluted blood from the American prison system.
Yes, he did.
And that's your recollection of what Dr. Davis said to you?
Yeah. And there was Bill's recollection as well, because obviously we talked about it quite a lot. And it was sort of, we talked about it. Obviously, the children were far too young to understand any of this, but we talked about it a lot because, how could this be? How could we be importing blood or blood products to the American prison system? And it just seemed to us, and especially as there was a heat treatment, say they'd realised they'd done this, there was a heat treatment that would have significantly reduced the risk. Why was nothing done about that? And I think even at that stage, Bill felt, he felt very, it sort of sowed the seeds of mistrust, which he'd not had up to then in the system that was treating him. Because he really felt, and obviously Dr. Davis did have integrity. People had taken, a lot of care of him, and he was very grateful for it all. But the first time he started to think, what is going on here? Can I place my trust in the system?
And you've said that Dr. Davis very much wanted to help Bill, and at that meeting wasn't trying to hide anything and was trying to tell you everything he knew about how this had come to be.
Yes, and I remember it was quite a long meeting, because normally meetings with him were very quick. You know, he wouldn't sort of waste time. He would just tell you what it was. He was very professional, but, you know, he wasn't part of the, you know, didn't do a lot of tender loving care, but he didn't need to, because, you know, he'd seen through Bill, you know, through some really rough times. So normally his meetings would be 10 minutes, quarter of an hour. But A, he'd asked me to come along, and B, it was at least 3/4 of an hour long. And, you know, he sat there, and he sat there for a bit, and I knew how uncomfortable he was feeling.
At this stage, were you told about the risks of transmission of hepatitis C?
No, I was neither told about it then or at any other time during the entire treatment.
But Bill was a scientist.
Yes.
And so he was concerned, wasn't he?
He was.
So what did he do about risks of transmission?
Well, certainly certainly initially when he came out of hospital, he was incredibly careful, because, you know, he had to be careful with hygiene generally. If he had a small cut even, he would make sure it was bound up straight away. He was very, very particular about any kind of, putting sterilisation creams on his hands, those sorts of things. He was very, very particular, because, you know, I think he was just worried that his contact with the children might compromise them in some way. I remember, him being quite worried about it, and he talking to me about it, and I would then take the same level of precaution, because obviously it wouldn't be our intention. He didn't want to co-infect me, and he certainly didn't want to affect the children in any way. So it was difficult, but nobody ever said, and I was supposed partly reassured by what the medics had said, that it was actually going to be okay, that there wouldn't be co-infection. And to be honest, when you've got 3 young children, you know, there is a lot of physical contact. You can't avoid it. I probably did more of the chores because of it. I probably felt, you know, it was safer. And then I think we just got used to being a family again. And but I would say he was always watchful about that. He was always careful not to do, you know, if he had a cut or blood, you know, he suspected it wasn't as straightforward as that.
In those early days, in the sort of early 90s, mid-90s, how did the infection impact Bill?
I think in the early days, you know, it was such a relief to have got through the treatment on the leukemia. You know, he came out, and he needed quite a lot of recovery time. So that summer after he came out, you know, they gave me a month off work, which is actually the only time I took off work. And, you know, he was just glad to be alive, you know, he used to touch the grass.
And you've said that he was mostly fairly well.
He was.
But he was constantly tired.
He was tired. Things that never used to tire him out before did. He'd lost a lot of weight, so I put him on quite a high protein diet, try and build his strength again. And, you know, he gradually, you know, by the Christmas, I would say, he was gradually functioning fairly normally. And really that continued for a while. And by about 1995, I was noticing more fatigue. He was quite short-tempered at times, which is very unlike him. And it was just simply he was exhausted. And he was always really asking questions about what was going on and not getting answers. I think that frustrated him. And I certainly know he talked to me quite a lot about that. And towards the end of that period, the 1990s, he was actively on various clinical trials that Royal Free put him on to see if they could cure the Hep C. He was always very keen to. He didn't mind being a guinea pig for things. He was courageous. He wanted to live. He wanted to see his kids grow up. So he was very determined about trying to pursue every opportunity he was given for any kind of clinical trial.
You've said that in 1997, 1998, Bill went on to a series of experimental treatments to try and clear the Hep C.
He did.
How did he cope with them physically?
Well, it was the first time it was really awful because, you know, I'd get in from work and he was literally, you know, he'd be flat out. He was exhausted. He was really, really tired. He used to fall asleep, even in the middle of a conversation. And, you know, he worked hard at work, and he used to come home and just go to bed. obviously the children had to help out more. So William by this stage was coming up to secondary school age, and he used to make the tea and look after his sisters. And we had a childminder in as well, because basically, it wasn't an option. He had to rest, he had to take it easy. And I was getting in later. I had the long distance commute. Bill had the local job. That was what we did. He was a teacher, he worked locally, used to pick up the children from school and bring them home and that sort of thing. Obviously, he couldn't do any of that. So I just fairly subtly as I could, built in extra help, because he didn't like to feel he was depending on people. He didn't like to feel he was imposing on the children. But in effect, our way of life did change quite radically. And, and I changed my job in 1997 to a full-time job because I was worried about the financial future. So I just, again, got more help in. And basically, I would say Bill struggled, and especially around the year 2000, I remember there was a whole series of events where he was really not well. He had a very, very long episode of flu just before the year 2000, and he was in bed for a long periods of time. He had a bit of time off work. It was one of the few times he took time out of work. And the children were quite worried about him. Well, I was very worried about him as well.
You've described in your statement that those experimental treatments completely floored him.
They did.
And he suffered poor digestive and sleep patterns, sore skin, constant fatigue, loss of appetite, a big swollen stomach, cramping, and his eyesight deteriorated. And that from about 2002, he'd lost some of his mobility as well.
Yes, he was registered as disabled from 2002. He couldn't walk more than about 100 yards unassisted. And, he was at school, and he had to retire from his full-time job, which is head of department in this school, very responsible job, which he loved. And they were very good in the school, and they gave him a part-time, lesser job that he could do. He could just sustain it 3 days a week. And so he took part of his pension because he was significantly worse off. And we sort of managed it, really. But I know he felt a sense of loss, a part of himself during that period. And it was, it kind of ate away at him, really.
Bill hadn't told anyone at the school about his infection apart from the head teacher. Why was that?
I think he felt, every time he went to the hospital for a treatment, people used to ask him, have you got diabetes? What drugs are you on? They used to assume that because he had Hep C, he was a drug addict. And whilst Bill was sitting alongside people who had HIV, and he didn't have any prejudice about it himself, he felt he was being judged in the same way that they were being judged. And he felt the unfairness of that and the stigma that was attached to it. And he never sought to sort of say, look, I'm not a drug addict. But it used to upset him, and he didn't want the children to feel they had to explain this to anyone else. And indeed, it was really by accident that Will found out about Bill's Hep C, because he opened a letter addressed to his dad, because they had the same Christian name. And so he opened it by mistake, and then he asked his dad about it. And then Bill told him. So he never lied to the children, and we never lied to the children, but we were very economical with truth. And we only told them what we thought they would, be able to reasonably understand. And as I say, Will took more of the responsibility because of that, but obviously the girls found out from William. We didn't tell him not to tell them or anything like that. But, he didn't want assumptions to be made in the school by the staff or the students that he wasn't a safe teacher, that he'd been on drugs, etc. And he was worried about that.
Bill also played down his physical symptoms a lot, didn't he?
He did.
Why was that?
Well, it's sort of in his genes. It was in his genes, really. A man's a man in the northeast. I don't know if any of you've lived in the northeast, but it's a very proud generation of men who are very. His dad was a miner. He was of that stock. He didn't like to be weak. He didn't like to depend on people. He was a very and he didn't really want to impose on people ever. He especially didn't want to be a burden. So he covered it up.
And he compared himself to his dad, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
What did he say?
He said, I might have worked a hard shift today, but not as hard as my dad.
Bill also hated being in the hospital.
He did.
So you worked incredibly hard to keep him at home throughout the time. And he was rarely admitted into hospital. But in 2004, because of the hepatitis C, Bill suffered renal failure and required regular dialysis. How often did he go into hospital for that?
He had to go in really for a full day, 3 days a week, because it was rarely a straightforward procedure, because by now he had quite severe liver damage. And also there were lots of other things wrong with him. Some of his other symptoms were being treated as well. So there was a long list of drugs he was on. So sometimes after his dialysis, he would have a lot of complications. And at this stage, his dialysis was in a different hospital. It was at Barnet, which is a satellite of the Royal Free. And the reason why he was there, because it was slightly closer to home, because we lived in Hertford. So it was still a 40-minute drive to Barnet. And it was an hour and a half to get to the Royal Free. So they said, well, you have your routine dialysis at Barnet, which was, good in some ways because it was closer. But the problem was that Barnet wasn't really it didn't have all the specialists that Bill was being treated by at the Royal Free. He was seeing a blood specialist, liver specialist, kidney specialist, all of those people. So his care was more done then at Barnet, and they didn't have all those people on tap, as it were. So if there were complications, which there frequently were after his dialysis, he would be transferred by ambulance. I'd get a phone call at work saying he was going to be on through emergency admission to the Royal Free. And it was the complication of all of that, going by ambulance, arriving at the Royal Free. Even though he's well known to them and they knew his condition, he would then have to go through A&E and be assessed by a doctor. And when I wasn't with him, he'd be left all to his own devices for several hours in A&E. He hadn't had his proper dialysis. He had severe problems, and he'd be cold, and he would have no water and no food because there wasn't any staff on hand to do it. It wasn't neglected. They just didn't have the time. They were a busy A&E department, and they wouldn't transfer him straight onto the renal ward, which is where he needed to be in order to resume the dialysis and also to get proper treatment. And this happened to me time without number from that period onwards, from 2004. Sometimes the children were with me. They would run off and get some food for him or a glass of water or whatever, and they will bear witness to the numbers of times we were kept waiting for very long periods of time, sometimes as much as 10 or 12 hours. And if we hadn't have been there, I am quite convinced, as I sit here, that Bill would have died.
You have significant concerns about how chronically unwell patients are transferred between hospitals.
Yes.
And why it took so long each time Bill was transferred into the Royal Free, and why he had to go through A&E at all.
That was the really fundamental point I wanted to make. It felt to me like a completely redundant procedure. They knew exactly what was wrong with him. They would ring from Barnet to the Royal Free saying he was going to be admitted. I actually spoke to the registrar on the renal ward many times. It became also a friend called Nick Lever. He used to come down to A&E and say, look, put him straight on the ward. There's a bed there. Why is he being kept here? But they just would not discharge him from A&E until he'd seen a doctor. And that took these long waits. And they would assess him all over again. They would ask him, did he have diabetes, which he clearly didn't have. They would ask him what drugs he was on, which he wasn't. And they would make him go through a full medical assessment before they would transfer him up to the ward. And it just felt like a really cruel and really unnecessary procedure.
You've seen some of Bill's medical records, and there are some of them that refer to him drinking heavily. What's your view of that?
Well, I just don't believe them because I lived with Bill. I was married to him for 30 years. He had an incredibly busy life. He went out one night a week with his best mate, John. They went to the pub and they must have had 3 pints, maximum. So I don't know where that comes from. I don't know why that's been... And that was never said to me. And to the best of my knowledge, it was never said to Bill.
In 2005, 2006, Bill's sister offered to give him one of her kidneys.
She did.
And she was assessed as to whether she could be a live donor. And And in December 2007, it was said that Bill would undergo the last few tests before receiving a transplant from his sister. How was Bill feeling about that?
He was really, well, he'd been asking for a transplant for a while, and he had been put on a transplant list before that. But he was told his chances were quite low. So that's really why, his sister stepped forward. Because basically they said, you've got all of these viral conditions, it's got this viral condition, so it will attack a new organ potentially, and you might be in the same position. It might delay the impact of it, but it would just buy you time. But to be honest, he would have bought that time. And I think he also felt that there was a lot of other people in the queue. He was told he was, not a priority patient because he was older, and there was chances of him dying from the transplant procedure itself. And he was warned about all those things, and he did understand all those things. He wasn't stupid. But I think he always felt, it always gave him hope that, this might be possible. And if there was a 1% chance of survival, and it was his risk alone, he would have taken it. And I think, when his sister was involved, that's obviously a bit more complicated. I think at that point he thought, well, what about if Eileen should become ill, and as a result of donating the kidney? So he did worry about that. But he was still hopeful that the doctors would consider giving him a transplant. And that was somewhat encouraged by, I think, a conversation in 2007, which I've only just seen the notes for. So some of these documents I've never seen. In fact, most of them I've never seen. And I know you're going to probably raise this, but some of these notes have been made available to the clinicians who've responded to my witness statement, but I've never seen them. And I think we're given the state that Bill was in during all of these discussions about transplantation, he was not in the best state. This is after 2004. This is after all of the hospital treatments he's having. He had frequent bouts of encephalitis where he didn't actually recognise his own children, where he didn't make a whole bunch of sense. And yet he was being treated almost as knowing the answers to some of these questions, or even knowing what questions to ask. And I was not in any of those meetings, apart from 2, where I invited myself. And that was not till 2008.
So through 2005, 6 and 7, tests were being done to establish whether a transplant could be undertaken. But by 2008, late 2008, it became clear that the medical team were saying a transplant would not be possible because of the number of conditions that were in play. Bill had, there was considerable damage to his liver.
Yeah.
His kidneys were obviously, he was in kidney failure, but he also had difficulties with his bone marrow by that point as well.
He did.
And it was at that, so late 2008, that you were invited, or you invited yourself, to the multidisciplinary team meeting for that final decision.
It was.
You've said in your statement that a particular doctor, Dr. Jenny Cross, told Bill that she would deny his kidney transplant request, and you're critical about how she dealt with that issue. My understanding is that you don't criticise the clinical decision, but rather you criticise how she dealt with that with Bill and your involvement in that decision. Do you want to say any more about that?
Yes, I want to clarify that point because I suppose by that stage I probably had in my own mind anyway accepted that, this was absolutely a multidisciplinary decision, that it was, taking all the circumstances into account, it probably was the right decision. But we didn't feel that it was Bill's decision. We felt that was being taken away from him. And I hadn't been involved in those discussions and decisions, and neither had he. He'd been there, but I hadn't been. And he needed an advocate at that stage. So I felt really overlooked, and I know he felt the little bit of control he had left on his life was being taken from him. And there was a lack of compassion and understanding of him as an individual, which I think by that stage shouldn't have been, because they would have understood what a pitiable position he was in, what a humiliating position he was in, and how much he needed to understand what was happening to him. So I feel there was a failure of the way he was treated in that process, and that if I'd have been there at some of those meetings, he would have at least had the opportunity to have his mind set at rest that somebody else had been able to raise his concerns for him, even though, it was very difficult for him to go to those meetings. He was sitting there in his best suit with holes in his feet.
We've obviously asked Dr. Cross for a response to your witness statement, and she said that she considered that Bill had capacity and that discussions were held with him, and she wasn't aware that you wanted to be involved in those discussions until August 2008, and thereafter you were part of the discussions.
Well, all I would say is she knew full well that Bill had repeat episodes of encephalitis. She must have witnessed his confusion at times, and that was evident from 2004. That episode I described where he didn't recognise his own children happened in the hospital in 2004. So I just think it betrays a lack of knowledge of Bill, which would be unreasonable at that stage. And I think it also shows a lack of compassion.
In her response, Dr. Cross has exhibited a number of medical records. Were you aware that she was going to access Bill's medical records?
No.
And I think you've said already, but have you seen the documents that were exhibited prior to this?
Not prior to this inquiry, and I didn't see any of them until last week.
You've also said that Dr. Cross told Bill on several occasions that he wouldn't be resuscitated beyond a certain point, and you and Bill felt that this was said as a threat. Dr. Cross has responded that those are words she wouldn't have used, nor did she mean them as a threat, but she did want to make a clear statement of what was best in Bill's care. Again, do you have a response to that you want to make?
Well, I think, it's really a question for her to address, but my view is that that's how he felt. I wasn't at all of those discussions, but he did show me a letter from her, which has not been disclosed, in which she put something in writing about the whole remission question, because I think in her own way she was seeking permission from him not to resuscitate. But the way it came over to Bill was that would be her decision and not his, because by then he'd be in a coma, and that she would make that decision really without regard to his wishes. That's how he interpreted it. Now, he may have been wrong. He may have misinterpreted what she said, but I have no means of judging that. And when she's put it in a letter as well, that's when it started to really prey on his mind, because he felt she was interpreting that as his consent when he hadn't given his consent. And so I think there was a mixture of issues going on there. And as I wasn't present in those discussions, I can't really say anything more than that. She may have meant things to come out differently, but I know its impact on him. He felt he hadn't had his transplant. He felt he'd been told that he wouldn't be revived if he fell into a coma, as he understood it. And I think it caused him to lose hope. And again, I think it betrayed a kind of lack of compassion in the way that was dealt with.
And for you, you were particularly concerned that, again, you weren't involved in those discussions.
Exactly. I didn't feel really that I was involved in any of it unless I made it happen. So it's one thing to say I'm available at any time, but it's another thing to actually say, well, would you like your wife to come in? And we'll involve her in the next meeting. There was no proactivity about it. It was like he was really just another patient. And even in those 2 clinical discussions I attended, which were multidisciplinary and where I recognised quite a few of the doctors, because they were all people treating him at the Royal Free, with whom Bill had a very friendly relationship, and I did too. Even in those meetings, there was a technical dialogue going on, which Bill was supposed to be able to follow, and I was supposed to be able to follow. And we were sat there like we were not part of this. And I felt it was like a parallel universe happening, where we were incidental. It was all about a technical discussion between them about what was best for Bill, all in technical language that I couldn't understand. I'm sure Bill couldn't, because, he wasn't terribly well. And I felt, well, why would you do it like that? So it wasn't just the Jenny Cross issue. It's very much how these issues are handled that I'm wanting to get to, because I think it could have been handled so much better. And if we'd understood and even agreed with the decisions, it would have made it much easier for Bill to accept them. And I could have helped him to accept them, whereas I didn't actually understand them myself.
You've said that in that late 2008, in the multidisciplinary team meetings, Bill was sitting there with holes in his feet.
Yes.
By then, he'd developed an ulcer on the underside of his feet. Can you tell us how that had arisen?
Well, he put his shoes on one morning. He didn't have any sensation in his feet. He had no feeling in his feet at all. And he's dressed formally to go to work. He put his best shoes on, reinforced now because his skin was very, very tender. And he had a watch in his shoe. And I didn't know he had a watch in his shoe. He put his own shoes on. Didn't want other people to wait on him. Put his own shoes on, and he walked around for 2 weeks with this watch in his shoe, and it wore a hole in his foot, which became very infected. And then he actually had problems with his other foot as well. So he had to be treated regularly for yet more appointments at the Royal Free by the podiatrist there. And it was Nick Lever, the same person I talked about earlier, who'd been tried to be the go-between between A&E and the renal ward in the Royal Free. He was the person who got him seen by the podiatrist and set up those series of appointments. But he had necrosis of his feet. All the cells were dead. So he had no sensation. And his feet were rotting. And they talked then about amputation. And I think even just that word amputation was pretty horrific after all the things he'd been through.
At the start of 2009, Bill had a very severe internal stomach bleed. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, I had really it was one of his so-called routine appointments where he got transferred from Barnet to the Royal Free, and Dr. O'Byrne saw him at the Royal Free, and they were very concerned, and it'd been notified to them by a number of different appointments that he was getting blood loss on a regular basis, stomach bleeds, and that they weren't able to control the stomach bleeds, and that if they couldn't control the stomach bleeds, he would bleed to death. So Dr. O'Byrne said, look, I've never done this operation before, but I am going to go into his stomach, and I'm going to tie the varices that were causing the bleeding. I'm going to tie them. I'm going to freeze them so that he can't bleed. But it's a very dangerous operation, and he's probably not going to survive it. But I've talked to Bill about it, and he wants to do it. And he asked me my opinion, and I said, well, absolutely. If Bill wants to do it, that's the right thing to do. And anyway, you're telling me that's the best hope he's got, and he's going to bleed to death otherwise. So he said, the most it'll give him is another 6 months of life, is what he said at the time. And that's exactly what did happen. But the children were all with me, and we stayed in the hotel opposite the Royal Free, so we could be there, because when he came round from his operation, it was very, very late at night. We wanted to be sure that he would be, okay for the night, that he wouldn't die. And my daughter, Rhiannon, who sat there today, she actually stayed in the hospital when he came back from the ward. The rest of us slept at the hotel opposite, but Rhiannon stayed with him till the morning. And we went back in the morning, and he was, he was conscious, which was the main thing. And he came round from that operation. But as I say, I felt the whole family was treated well at that point, because he had been very clear with us, Dr. O'Byrne, the risk he was taking, why he was taking it. Bill gave his consent, we gave our consent, and it was carried out, obviously Dr. O'Byrne's a considerable man to have pulled that one off. And I suppose his relationship with him was very solid, and I think that was, how I'd wished Bill had been treated all the way through.
Sadly, Dr. O'Byrne's assessment was right, and Bill died on the 28th of July 2009. But through 2009, Bill was actually still working, wasn't he? When did Bill stop working?
A month before he died. He basically, he used to get transport to get him to schools. He had a full-time carer by this point. He could only go in a wheelchair, and he couldn't stand for his classes. But he used to go into school and do A-level physics classes, the same as he always had done. And the kids were very kind to him. The sixth formers all understood. They didn't know what was wrong with him, but they obviously knew he was very ill. And, he never had any discipline problems anyway, as I said. But with sixth formers who want to get their A's in their physics to get to a good university, and he was a very good teacher. And he had support from his colleagues. The headmaster was amazing. Still have a great relationship with him. I understood Bill, understood exactly how he ticked, how important it was to him to keep his pride and his profession. And so we all, in some invisible way, conspired to keep him in his work as long as possible. But he was struggled a lot of days, took him a whole hour and a half to get dressed. And, I took some time off work, just odd days, so I could just be there when he came home and make sure he was all right. And I worked with Steve, who was the carer, to make sure that, he was looked after, basically.
Can you tell us about the impact of Bill's infection and death on your children?
Well, they've all put their witness statements in, and my daughter Fiona's here. They were all affected, obviously, in various ways. I think Will had to grow up quite quickly. He's always been the one, I would say, who's had the most understanding of what was going on at the various stages, simply because of his age, and he took a lot of responsibility. They were all brilliant with Bill. They never made him feel other than their dad. He wasn't the ill person in the family, he was just their dad. That was really important. So I think they all put up a brave face, and I'm sure have had many sad moments, both when he was with us and since. As I said, particularly, I know my daughters all felt badly when Bill was not there at their weddings, and when he was not there at Henry's birth, and that they miss him very much.
And for you, what's been the impact for you?
Well, I'm a bit of a mess right now. I've had a time to think about what the effect really has been. I think it really from that first. I had a 30-year marriage with Bill. First 10 years, really happy. Lovely children, everything going for us. And, like all married couples, you have your ins and outs. But it were a really happy period of time. Never regretted marrying Bill, never regretted having my children. And then from that diagnosis with leukemia, I felt I suddenly had to be the responsible parent. Right from, the year when he was in and out of hospital, I was just, I had to be the one who was there, saw him and looked after the 3 children and was working and all of that. So on various stages, I've had quite a few financial worries because he was on sick pay for a while then, and I was only working part-time. And we bought a house to be near the school, and then we had negative equity on the house, and, it's a lot of pressure on me to keep the home fires burning. Bill worried about all of that, so I was kind of careful not to, and I've never discussed this with the children. So a lot of pressure. And then really after 2000, it really got a lot worse. Somehow Bill being then working part-time, he was clearly needing more help and support. And I did get that help and support. I got people in to help. But then more financial pressure. So it was like this knife edge all the time, worrying when I got home what sort of state he'd be in. I kept home late very often. He'd have been home for some hours. He'd be in bed. Didn't want to discuss his treatment. That's the last thing he wanted to talk about. So I think both he and I felt there was little time to communicate properly. He never really wanted to talk about his illness. He just wanted to lead as normal a life as possible. So I guess the level of time we could spend, which was stress-free, was quite small. And I got this back problem, which is not treated by the doctor. I think he had a problem focusing on it being me and not Bill that was the problem. And he put me on these very intense painkillers for 2 years, and I never did get a back operation with the NHS. I had to go privately. But that was partly because I need to schedule it in so it could fit around Bill's treatments and also my work schedule. So, everything seemed to be done in the least possible disruptive way. So just to do those things, I had to be incredibly focused and planned all of the time. I remember William saying to me, "Mum, why do you always run everywhere?" And it was a really simple explanation. I was never had enough time to do everything. And my kids, were leaving for university, but before that was obviously exams that they were going through. Bill used to help as much as he could. But, from being a very involved dad and doing a lot of the shopping and cooking and the cleaning, and he used to do everything with me around the house and for the children, he clearly couldn't. So there's a lot of stuff building up there. Plus, I was anxious a lot of the time, so I got a lot of stress and anxiety, and I had periods of depression.
Throughout the time of Bill's illness until he died, were either you or Bill ever offered any psychological support or counselling?
No.
it was only after Bill died that you sought some private counselling.
And to be honest, I probably realised at some point, I think my sister Enid, who's a nurse, told me at some point I should get some counselling. And I probably realised that I needed it, but I didn't have any time for counselling. There wasn't any time to go and be counselled. That would create more pressure. You know, finding the time to do that, the normal stuff was hard enough. But to try and go and get counselling, which, you know, I just thought, well, it's not going to solve any of my practical problems. What good is it going to do if I'm being counselled and then I miss one of Bill's appointments?
You've spoken a little bit that there were financial difficulties with Bill going part-time, which forced you to work full-time. But there were still significant financial challenges. You received some payments from the Skipton Fund. What's your view of the process that's been involved in obtaining those?
Well, I think in my witness statement I used the word transactional, and that's a correct description of my relationship with the Skipton Fund. And also, it was me that had to be proactive. So initially it was Bill in the early 2000s. He'd read in the paper that there was some compensation available. And he wrote to the Department of Health at that point and asked what he should do. And they advised him to approach the Skipton Trust, which he duly did. And in 2005, I think it was, he got a payment from the Skipton Trust. But it was couched in a way that this is it, you know, that's your payment, you know. And we were very, very grateful to have any money at all, because we'd given up on the idea that there would either be an inquiry or any proper investigation of what had happened, and we'd given up on the idea there would be any compensation. So it was, you know, like manna from heaven, really, but that's how it was. It was not explained what it was for. It was a payment I was going to get because the Department of Health had agreed that these payments should be made. There was no investigation of his family circumstances or, you know, how has it affected you? There was no sort of negotiation. It was transactional. And then later, after Bill died, there was I got a letter in the post, actually forwarded on to me by the Royal Free, I believe, saying that they'd been contacted by the Skipton Fund, this is 4 years after his death, to say that Bill was owed a second stage payment. And the letter that had come with them had come from Skipton. They sent that correspondence on, in which Skipton had found out that he died, or been told he died, and they were then pursuing the second stage payment because it was clear from his death certificate that a second stage payment was due. So in 2013, I think I had a payment of same amount as had been given to Bill initially, and that was also regarded as the final stage. And then in 2017, I read somewhere about bereavement payments. So I contacted Skipton at that point. This is like 8 years after Bill's death. And they said, oh, yeah, you're definitely due a bereavement payment, but we're shutting up shop. So, you know, this is it now. This is your bereavement payment. Provide the death certificate and we'll just send it to you, which is what they did. So they didn't make any bones about it. They were never awkward or difficult. They just weren't proactive. Everything was late, and it was done really in a way, that's it. And when I rang the chap to talk about it, he said, look, this isn't anything to do with me. These are decisions made elsewhere. You know, and it was sort of, you should be just grateful, really, which we were. We were grateful to have any help from them. But then he said there's 10,000 people like you, you know, like it was my fault there were 10,000 people like me. And I thought at the time, 10,000 people? That's a huge number of people. And I became aware, I suppose, for the first time of the scale of this, because he was, you know, told me about the other trusts. And I also became aware at that point that the levels of compensation were being paid out were very, very different by the different trusts. And I started getting in touch with other people who had been affected and found out about the all-party parliamentary group on contaminated blood and the various... And I also referred back then to I'd given a statement to Archer Inquiry earlier and done various things to try and raise my concerns, but we'd never had anything back, not even acknowledgements of any of the correspondence. And it just contributed to this general feeling that nobody really cared enough to do anything about it.
And your criticism of the Skipton Fund is twofold, isn't it, Ruth? One, that it was very transactional and lacked compassion. And secondly, this very long delay before you received the second stage payment and even longer before you received the bereavement payment.
Yes, and I suspect if I hadn't rung them, I wouldn't have had the bereavement payment at all.
before I finish asking you questions, you've provided a photograph of Bill. Could we have that? Would you like to just tell us when the photo was taken? Or would you rather I did?
I'll do it. So it was taken in 2007 when I got my OBE. And we went to the palace together, and Bill was, not good. But he came, he had his best suit on, and all the children were there. And it was one of the happiest days of all of our lives.
Ruth, those are the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you would like to say?
I would, if I may. I'm not going to talk for too long, but I just wanted to say the way I feel about it all, and the way I know Bill would feel about it now, is that it's so important the truth comes out. That's why this inquiry is so important. We need to know who, what, where, and when the decisions on blood were made, and whence they were made, that they would have been communicated properly to patients and their families, both about the Hep C itself and what the treatment options might have been. What we've experienced is that quite a lot of stonewalling and cover-ups, and those have been, I think, well documented in various other witness statements. I felt most of the way through that the media knew more about this than I did. That there were things being released, from about 2000 in Sky News and other places about this, but nobody ever contacted me to sort of explain, what was going on or what redress there might be, even though we were pretty proactive in trying to get more of a dialogue going about what we could do about it. I wrote to Alan Johnson in April of 2009 when I knew Bill was going to die. He'd had that dreadful operation in January. We knew. And Bill asked me, he said, look, we'll give it one more go, write to the guy, see if we can get an explanation. I didn't get an acknowledgement from him or from any of his team in the Department of Health. I actually knew Alan Johnson through my job, and I wasn't trying to curry favour, but I wanted to say to him, look, can you find out for me what's going on? Can you take this up personally? Nothing at all. I feel the Independent Blood Authority didn't really exist as an independent body because it actually reported directly to the Secretary of State, so there was always that suspicion, if not the reality, of potential political intervention in those original decisions not to screen the blood. And I would say that blood screening is such an important issue. Apparently there are many viruses that happen and can happen every day. So the independence of that body, with proper people from both the medical profession and lay people, would seem to me to be an absolutely crucial thing to be looking at. The blood screening affects so many people, in terms of the transfusions people have, accidents. It could affect any man or woman in this country. And not to have independence around that screening process. And it also occurred to me later in the day that, if the original reason was shortages of blood in the UK, which I understand it was, then to avoid that problem, there could be a much better donation system where people automatically give blood every year. It becomes part of the culture of the UK. And, none of these ideas or suggestions, as far as I'm aware, have been taken up or treated seriously. I think it's all been about protecting backs, protecting political backs, protecting departmental backs. I've had nothing from them in terms of a proper explanation of any of the things that have happened to Bill or really the family. And I think the other thing I'd mention is the lack of long-term, real care for long-term critically ill patients. And I know that applies to other people I've heard in this inquiry, that when somebody is well known to the, and been through lots of treatments, that aspect of continuity of care, of having read the notes properly, having noted the condition, having worked out what's going on, and having a proper transfer system from one hospital to another. I feel if nothing else happens, I'd like to see those systems massively improved for the benefit of everybody, not just Bill, but all the other people I saw in a critical condition not being attended to. And I'd like to also end on a note of thank you, really. I'd like to thank Dr. Davis for being a total star. I'd like to thank Dr. Sweeney O'Byrne and Lever for their care and compassion. I'd like to thank my children for bearing with me through some very difficult times and understanding even when they didn't. I'd like to thank our wider families, especially Bill's sister Eileen, for her willingness at 67 to go through a kidney donation procedure. And I remember when the consultant interviewed her to assess her psychological suitability, he said to her, and physical suitability, he said to her, how far can you run? And she said, well, how far would you like me to run? And that was the consistent attitude of his family. They couldn't have supported him more. And I want to thank this inquiry. Everyone I have met during the course of this inquiry has been compassionate and kind. And I've also been humbled by all of the other stories of the other victims and their dignity and humility. Thank you.
I'm just going to turn and ask if Mr. Snowden has any further points.
Well, thank you from my point of view for your dignity and humanity and your thoughts. Thank you very much. And thank you to Fiona for being with you. I think it may have affected her, obviously, as much as it's affected you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, we'll take a break there for coffee until 12 o'clock, when I think we have a witness who wishes to be known as Aid.
That's correct, yes.
Otherwise known as Adrian Goodyear.
Correct, sir, yes.